Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Now that we're in order in the Readiness Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee, we're good to go. I want to welcome our committee members. And the question before us is the U.S. military ready for climate change? Recent events indicate considerable doubt. Just this last year, Hurricanes Florence and Michael caused billions of dollars of damage to Camp Lejeune and leveled much of Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida. California wildfires led to the evacuation of family housing at Camp Pendleton, Naval Air Station Magoo, and the Marine Corps Mountain Warfare Training Center in the Sierras. In addition, our coastal installations and the surrounding communities are already experiencing significant flooding due to sea level rise. The Army's Ronald Reagan Ballistic Missile Defense Test Site at the Kwajalein Atoll in the South Pacific is threatened by sea level rise and may not last 20 years. The Navy's principal Atlantic Base, Norfolk Hampton Roads, and the Naval Academy are already experiencing flooding. Melting polar ice in the Arctic regions has already opened new sea routes and competition for resources. Yet it appears that the Department of Defense has not yet developed a systemic strategy for ensuring U.S. national interest in the Arctic. The United States military is one of the largest employers in the world. It's also one of the largest energy consumers. The DoD owns millions of acres of global real property, including over 550,000 facilities valued at over $1 trillion. And the department is uniquely situated to enhance its readiness and resiliency through effective energy policy and programs. Installations are where we generate the force, train and sustain them, and in many cases house critical operational missions. One way to enhance readiness is to consume less. In fiscal year 2017, the Department of Defense consumed over 85 million barrels of fuel to power ships, aircraft, combat vehicles, and bases, and it cost nearly $8.2 billion. In many cases, though, contract vehicles and energy-saving performance contracts, these energy savings and resiliencies enhancement improvements can be made at no upfront cost to the department. In contested environments, better fuel consumption rates extend the range and mitigate the risk related to resupply convoys. Naval vessels are vulnerable during at-sea replenishment. For austere land-based sites in remote locations supporting contingency operations, lower fuel and water consumption rates are an essential readiness enabler, helping the facility to maintain a lower profile. It is essential that our bases and facilities recover quickly from extreme weather events and energy disruptions that impact mission capabilities. Section 335 of the fiscal year 18 National Defense Authorization Act required the Department of Defense to report on the effects of climate change on the department and proposed mitigation plans. The required report was delivered to Congress in January 2019 and indicated that 2/3 of the 79 installations that were reviewed are vulnerable to flooding, more than half are vulnerable to drought, and about half are vulnerable to wildfires. Unfortunately, the report did not meet the congressional reporting requirement to describe future-focused mitigation necessary to ensure military resiliency. To ensure that it can perform its national defense mandate, the Department of Defense must plan for a variety of contingencies. In the 2014 Climate Change Adaptation Roadmap, the Department noted that rising global temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, climbing sea levels, and more extreme weather events will intensify the challenges of global instability and hunger and poverty and conflict. They will likely lead to food and water shortages, pandemic diseases, disputes over refugees and resources, and destruction by natural disasters in regions around the globe. Not only are these climate-related events impacting installation readiness, they're also creating more frequent requests for the military support for disaster relief and humanitarian assistance. Both active duty service members and National Guard personnel are increasingly responding to assist communities impacted by these events. Think Puerto Rico. Climate change represents a myriad of readiness challenges, both at home and abroad. It's not only a future threat, it is impacting resiliency of our installations and operations today. The Department must act now to address these challenges. From our witnesses today, we hope to learn from their perspective on readiness, the impact of climate change, and what actions the Department should be taking to address these challenges. Now with that, I'd like to turn over to our ranking member, our Rocky Mountain member, Congressman Doug Lamborn, for your remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I applaud the ongoing efforts of the Department of Defense to make installations more resilient and both installations and operations more efficient. But I wish to note from the outset that the Committee on Armed Services is not among the committees of jurisdiction for climate change matters. I understand that the House majority has directed each of the committee and subcommittee chairmen to have a hearing focused on climate change. However, when national energy policy is debated, this committee's role is to ensure that any emerging policy does not adversely affect military operations, an important but much more narrow issue. As each of our witnesses have noted, and will note in their testimony that we'll hear in a minute, many of the Department's 500 installations have experienced the effects of severe weather. The United States Armed Forces must be prepared to operate in adverse conditions. Further, it behooves us all to conserve resources wherever possible. In the case of military operations, fuel and water are critical commodities that are needed continuously and are difficult to transport. We depend on our military forces and installations for national security and cannot afford lapses in either. Our forces and our bases must be able to operate in all conditions of conflict and weather. We must take responsible action to make military installations more resilient and responsible action to lighten the logistical burdens on our operational forces. I emphasize responsible. By that I mean measures that enhance resiliency and national security, not arbitrary goals established for other reasons. I raise this concern because in the past, environmentally based mandates have squandered too much money and effort on greening the military. Given the small percentage of the nation's total power usage the DoD represents, placing arbitrary and costly mandates upon the military does not meaningfully affect global climate change, but it does reduce the Department's readiness. As we seek to enhance the resiliency of bases and reduce the vulnerability of our resource supply chains, I look forward to hearing about potential solutions. But if we diverge from our subcommittee's readiness jurisdiction in order to blame climate change for such things as the negative actions of international terrorist organizations or intergenerational tribal conflicts, I believe it will be a distraction from rebuilding our military's readiness at best, or an excuse to pursue boondoggles at worst. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I look forward to our witnesses' testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lamborn. We will clearly have a discussion in the days ahead, and we'll sort all of this out, which is our task. I want now to introduce our witnesses. I'll introduce all of you, and then I think, Mr. Titli, if you'll start. Our first witness is David W. Titli, Rear-Admiral, U.S. Navy, retired, professor of practice in meteorology at the Pennsylvania State University, and he's also the director of the Center for Solutions to Weather and Climate Risk. Joining him on the panel is Sharon Burke, Senior Advisor, International Security Program and Resource Security Program, and Nicholas Loris, Herbert and Joyce Morgan Fellow in Energy and Environmental Policy, Center for Free Markets and Regulatory Reform. Welcome. Thank you so very much for joining us. Thank you for the written testimony, which I think most of the members have in their file. And if you'll begin, Professor Titli.
Thank you very much, Chairman Garamendi and Ranking Member Lamborn, distinguished members of the subcommittee and other members of the Armed Services Committee for the opportunity to present today. I'm David Titli and currently serve as a founding director of the Center for Solutions to Weather and Climate Risk at the Pennsylvania State University. I retired from the United States Navy in 2012 as the oceanographer and navigator of the Navy and director of U.S. Navy Task Force Climate Change. I serve as an unpaid advisor for several organizations, including the National Academy of Science and the Center for Climate and Security. I'm testifying today in my personal capacity. Let me open with a personal note of thanks to the Congress, and especially to the House Armed Services Committee, for the addition of forward-thinking climate-related amendments in the markup language for the National Defense Authorization Act in 2018 and again in 2019. Speaking as one with nearly 35 years' experience in the executive branch, I will tell you it is hugely helpful to have congressional language and intent that encourages the Department of Defense to think in a proactive manner when managing climate risks. These bipartisan actions would not have been possible without significant Republican support, so thank you. In the Navy, we have a saying, just give me the bottom line up front or the bluff. So here's my bluff for today's hearing. Adapting for climate change is a readiness issue. It is not a partisan or political issue or a desire to appear green. The department needs to manage the risks of climate change to ensure its readiness in the years and decades to come. 2, the extremes of yesterday do not foretell the extremes of tomorrow. We have an excellent understanding of how our climate system operates based on 150 years of science. Science works. If we choose to heed its lessons, it will help us strengthen our security. While we plan for climate, we live in weather, its day-to-day variations, and more importantly, its extremes. The challenge for readiness and resilience is to ensure our military bases and infrastructure are designed for and can withstand the extremes of tomorrow. The rapid changing climate has significant impacts on our national security. The days of climate stability we have experienced for most of human civilization are over. Changing climate impacts national security in 3 major ways. First, changing the battle space or the physical environment in which our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines will operate. The Arctic is a prime example of an operational environment today that is undergoing rapid change. 2, posing increasing risks to the Department of Defense's installations. Without fully operational bases and training ranges in the United States, in addition to key overseas bases, U.S. forces cannot maintain the required levels of readiness. In addition to sea level rise threatening our coastal installations, other bases and training ranges are at risk from increased frequency and severity of wildfires, droughts, and floods. And although not the focus of today's hearing, it is important to also note that a changing climate can make already unstable situations worse, and sometimes catastrophically so. Climate change can be a powerful link in a chain of events that, if not broken, can lead to runaway instability. Our rivals have been paying close attention to the changing Arctic even while we were not. The Russians are rebuilding their Arctic military capabilities, albeit from very low post-Cold War levels. China declares itself to be a near-Arctic state and hopes to build a polar Silk Road as a northern flank in its Belt and Road initiative. China continues to aggressively court the Nordic states and Greenland. Climate change and its manifestations is a risk that we will need to manage for decades to come. It is not an issue that will be solved with any one single policy or program. So what to do? I have my full recommendations in the written statement, but here are some highlights. Develop a Department of Defense authorized standards for use and projections out to 50 years. I recommend the DoD produce and aggregate authoritative climate information that can inform risk management decisions on time and space scales and parameters that matter to the department. Develop a climate impacts handbook for each installation. While each installation is different, standardize the handbook to the degree practical. The U.S. Navy's Typhoon Havens Handbook could be one model. Build on and expand existing authorities, programs, and resources to ensure the Department of Defense, working in collaboration with other federal agencies and state, local, and tribal authorities, has both the resources and the authorities needed to adapt to climate issues that directly impact the installation, whether they are inside or beyond the fence line. Look for each service's top 1 or 2 near-term issues that should be supported and addressed today without further extensive analysis. For example, ensure our nuclear-capable shipyards are protected adequately from rising sea levels, storm surge, and freshwater flooding over the coming decades. Update our nation's Arctic strategy in response to changes in our national security strategy and defense strategy. In closing, 50 years ago, we went to the moon and returned safely, not knowing everything we needed to know at the start of that journey. America can still do amazing things when focused. In the future, when we look back, I hope we will be rightfully proud of what we accomplished starting in 2019 to buy down these climate risks. Thank you very much, sir, for your time and attention. I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your timeliness as well as your testimony, and both written and oral. Ms. Burke, if you would care to share your thoughts with us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Lambourne. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today, to appear in front of this subcommittee. And it would be, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that the opportunity to testify in front of a former colleague who's now serving the American people in a new capacity is truly inspiring. So, I should clarify that I do not speak for my organization today. I'm here in a personal capacity because they do not take corporate positions. I also have been asked to clarify that I do not speak for the Department of Defense, nor can they necessarily vouch for what I'm about to say. Now, of course, I did speak for the Department of Defense once upon a time, most recently as the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Operational Energy. And in that capacity, I got to do many great things. And one of them was to travel to Afghanistan with the logisticians and to see what these problems look like in situ. On one of those trips, our protocol officer knew that I wanted to see what real housing looks like forward. So she showed me her own CHU in Kabul. And now, this was a full-bird colonel, mind you, and her, she was sharing like a dingy, rattling compartment that was so small I could touch both walls. Down the hall, there was this faded poster, this Uncle Sam poster that said, "Don't waste energy, turn off the lights." So I tell you that not to suggest that this subcommittee needs to rush out and build McMansions on forward operating bases. I never met anyone in uniform who really wanted a flat screen TV in every tent. They know they're at war. I tell you that story because when it comes to energy and climate change, it has to be more than a poster on the wall. Our troops should know, instead, the opportunity cost for the force's immense energy footprint. There was a strategic cost, for example, as we trucked Russian fuel through all of Central Asia, which helped destabilize the government of Kyrgyzstan, according to an investigation by this body. There was a tactical and operational cost as combat patrols, convoys, helicopters, and C-130s delivered or protected fuel instead of conducting other missions. There was a human cost in lives. And these sorts of missions require far less fuel than would, say, maneuver warfare on the Korean Peninsula or any contingency in the Asia-Pacific with its vast distances. And there are potential adversaries there who are capable of far more lethal, precise, and far-ranging attacks than an IED or a weaponized human body. Moreover, the United States increasingly has an electrified force, which introduces an entirely new attack surface, one that the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI have publicly warned us that the Russians are seeking to exploit even now. The Department of Defense should increasingly take energy resilience into account as a planning factor and a capability enabler. When it comes to fixed installations, as the members of this subcommittee know, and as you said, Mr. Chairman, in the digital age, the bases are increasingly platforms that directly support military operations. They shouldn't be seen as dispensable overhead or some kind of slush fund. They're critical to readiness and to operations. The subcommittee should certainly ask the Pentagon to do a better job of assessing the vulnerability of these bases, not just to changing weather conditions, but also to the changing threat profile to critical infrastructure. And there's tremendous civilian expertise outside the department, including at universities around every base in this country. Now, the Pentagon should also be looking at climate change in light of our strategic priorities. While the National Defense Strategy did not explicitly acknowledge climate change as a shaping factor in great power competition, no country is immune to its effects, and that includes China and Russia. Our Phase Zero project has forthcoming research on this, which we've done together with Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and our early findings suggest that climate change will affect China's resource security and shape its strategic choices. It already does. We see resource security already figuring into the Belt and Road Initiative, but also in some of China's relationships with key U.S. allies, including Australia and Canada. Another top Chinese resource partner today is Russia, where the trade in energy, minerals, and agriculture undergirds a growing strategic partnership, which, needless to say, is unlikely to benefit the United States, including in the Arctic. The subcommittee should certainly ask that the Department of Defense report on how climate change and resource security will affect great power competition. You should ask, for example, how it's affecting our relationships, how we are bringing our relationships and alliances and trade into the equation. For example, how are we making sure that there will continue to be a free market for key minerals, which are so crucial to the information economy, to clean energy, and to a modern military? Climate change is highly likely to affect other military missions, such as humanitarian and disaster relief and defense support to civil authorities for disaster relief here at home. It already has. There are also indirect mission implications, as these conditions, as Dr. Titli said, may destabilize countries with poor or corrupt governance, weak economies, or a history of civil unrest and conflict. That, in particular, is not well understood, at least in terms of actionable information, and that's another role that the committee could play in asking for that kind of information, which would not only help build military capabilities, but also the broader national security priorities for development, trade, and diplomacy. So ultimately, climate change is certainly a security concern, but it's not necessarily one with a military solution. No soldier, sailor, airman, or marine can defeat climate change by shooting at it or blowing it up or even fishing it with a virus. Climate change is ultimately a governance and economic development challenge, and fundamentally a civilian and a civil society responsibility. On the other hand, while the Department of Defense has good reasons to account for energy and climate security now, if the nation does not have the adequate civilian capacity, if we do not innovate, if we do not get ahead of the changes that are underway and coming, they might also want to prepare for a worst-case scenario where it's entirely their mission to deal with the consequences. Thank you.
Chairman Garamendi, Ranking Member Lambourne, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to testify this afternoon. My name is Nick Loris, and I'm the Herbert and Joyce Morgan Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. The views I express in this testimony are my own and should not be construed as representing any official position of the Heritage Foundation. Keeping America safe is a nonpartisan issue. For the Defense Department to carry out its missions, ensuring military resilience and readiness is critical. Without question, extreme weather and long-term climate changes can harm DoD installations, training, and operations. Solutions to protect against such threats should achieve cost-effective, meaningful results. In this regard, I'd like to make several observations. First, preparing for natural disasters and adapting to land and water changes over time is pragmatic, common-sense policy. Safeguarding against current and future vulnerabilities with more durable infrastructure and innovative designs will mitigate risks and save lives. Employing local knowledge and specialized expertise will help tackle site and situation-specific challenges. The accumulation of scientific and technical data will assist in detecting the level of threat that extreme weather poses to the military. Productively, DoD has taken necessary steps to reduce risks facing DoD installations and operations. For example, Langley Air Force Base used flood visualization tools to understand flooding impacts on their base. Accordingly, they installed door dams, which are far more efficient and less labor-intensive than using sandbags. They've also implemented a shore stabilization plan and installed pumps to remove floodwater from their base. New construction at the base is occurring at higher levels of elevation. Moreover, Air Force bases in Florida are working with local experts to address coastal erosion and routinely conduct hurricane preparation exercises. And Navy Region Mid-Atlantic is working with a number of stakeholders in the area to protect against coastal storms, flooding, sea level rise, and land subsidence. This is just a small sample size of what the military is doing and should be doing to protect against climate-related risks. Congress should ensure that DoD has the necessary funding to carry out these activities that ensure military resilience and preparedness. My second observation is that Congress should refrain from implementing costly, ineffective energy policies intended to reduce DoD's climate footprint, but instead divert resources away from protecting America's vital national security interests. Although DoD is a large institutional energy consumer, it makes up only 1% of America's total energy use. Expensive, politically driven plans intended to shrink DoD's climate impact would have no meaningful impact on climate, producing a change in the Earth's temperature that is practically too small to even measure. Above all else, capability should drive DoD's energy choices. Policymakers should not force the military to buy pricier energy if no national security justification exists. In the past, DoD has spent money on renewable projects or costly biofuels where the national and energy security benefits were spurious. These policies leave fewer resources for training, modernization, and safeguarding DoD infrastructure, resulting in a less capable military. My third observation is that DoD research and development in alternative energy sources can, in fact, produce significant economic benefits through spin-off technologies, but that spending must prioritize national security needs first. Undoubtedly, renewable and alternative energy sources can offer unique advantages. For instance, lighter, more efficient batteries can lengthen the duration of a foot soldier's mission and reduce the weight of his or her backpack. Or the use of solar photovoltaics can extend the travel distances of drones. Furthermore, more fuel-efficient engines reduce the need for refueling, which we all know is a risk to our soldiers. And developing microgrids and utilizing very small modular reactor technologies can safely provide reliable power to isolated bases for long stretches of time. All of these initiatives can have broader economic value. To capture that value, Congress should ensure that the proper channels exist for the private sector to commercialize that research while protecting classified and sensitive information. Doing so will keep America safe while spurring clean energy innovation. In conclusion, whether carbon dioxide levels are rising, falling, or staying the same, the U.S. and the rest of the world will continue to experience extreme weather events. The climate will continue to change over time, and DoD must adapt to those changes no matter what the cause. DoD should continue to identify vulnerabilities and make targeted investments to strengthen military installations. Moreover, DoD should use the best available science and information to prepare for extreme weather and apply lessons learned to minimize future infrastructure and personnel risks. America's military should respond in kind to longer-term climate changes as well. However, wasteful energy mandates and spending will have a negligible impact on climate and make DoD worse off by allocating defense dollars away from more productive uses. Military spending on alternative energy technologies can have substantial geopolitical and economic benefits, but that spending should be mission and capabilities driven first. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lewis, and Ms. Burke, as well as Professor Tyndall. Before we launch into questions, just a little housekeeping note. This committee is open to all members of the Armed Services Committee. So if you have other members of the committee that are interested in joining us, please do, and I note that one is here. Ms. Lura, thank you very much for joining us from the Sea Power Subcommittee, as well as the full committee. And so pass the information on. So we want as many people many members of the committee that are interested to join us. I would draw the attention of the members of the committee and the witnesses to the last 2 pages of the briefing memo that Janine put together here. Actually, it's the last 3 pages. There are 2 pages of code that we have discovered in the last 2 NDAAs that speak directly to the issues before us. It's page 7 and 8 of the briefing memo. There is plenty of law out there. There are more than enough opportunities for the military to deal with the issues that have been raised by the witnesses. And our task is to address the impacts of climate change on the military. We could get into a long discussion between Mr. Lambourne and I as to exactly how that might be done. But the laws that are on the books pretty much tell us which direction we can and should go. I think really our task is to make sure that the Department of Defense is able to carry out these goals that are already in the law. And if we see along the way that there should be changes, then we'll have the opportunity in the next 3 months going forward. There's agreement among all the witnesses, and actually between Mr. Lambourne and myself, and perhaps the other members of the committee, that it's in the interest of the military to be resilient. It's in the interest of the military to address the challenges, whether they are weather or cyber, and to make sure that they're able to carry out their mission in those areas. I'm having trouble with that word, so please excuse me. I'll get it by tomorrow. In the meantime, just a couple of questions for the witnesses. Without getting into the cause of climate change, without getting into the issue of reducing greenhouse gases, the question for all of you is very direct. Is it in the interest of the military to reduce its energy consumption in the movement of vehicles, whether they are a ship or a tank or a truck or a car, and in the base itself? So this is energy consumption. Is it in the interest? And what would you say are the first 2 methods that you would recommend? So let's start with Mr. Lewis, and then we'll go reverse down the...
I would argue yes, absolutely. As long as that reduced energy use doesn't compromise the mission. And so I think if there's more investments in fuel-efficient technologies that reduce the need for refueling, that's a common sense approach. And these investments in battery technologies, I think that's offering a number of wide range of mission capabilities that we didn't even know existed, let alone a decade ago. And so I think the potential in the future for those technologies, both in the near term and the long term, are very valuable from a strategic sense and also just from a broader economic sense.
Thank you. Ms. Burke?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I think it is in the interest of the department to get more military output for less energy input. So for operations, you're talking about a future where the supply lines can be targeted, and we're, with precision weapons, with hypersonic missiles, the supply chain is a soft target, and our adversaries are well aware of that, as are any potential adversary has seen how well it has worked in Afghanistan and in Iraq. So it is in our interest to shrink that footprint and to protect it better on basis the same that the less we use, the more resilient we are. As far as setting targets, again, I would always put effectiveness in the lead. So not so much just set a flat consumption target, because if the force has to go do something, they may have to blow that target. So it's better to look in terms of the return you get for the energy you use and making that balance better and making sure that the energy you use serves the mission, whether it's, as Nick said, whether it's a solar hybrid generator or, a diesel generator, it has to serve the mission better.
Thank you. Mr. Tindall?
Thank you, sir, for the question. I would say it's in the interest of the department if one or both of the following conditions are met. When energy savings enhances warfighting effectiveness, when such efficiencies save money and resources that can then be applied to other aspects of readiness. So there's got to be something in it there. As far as what to do, I could pontificate on that, and I'm not going to. But what I would think about is a process very similar to what U.S. Navy Task Force Energy used, and I was part of when I was on active duty. We really looked at both how long it would take to return, what was the upfront cost, what was the return on that investment. There were a number of things that were like 2, 3, 4 years, do them. I would also be aware of former Deputy Secretary of Defense Bob Work's phrase of watch the fuss to fund factor. If you're going to do it, make sure there's a sufficient return.
Thank you very much. I will note, Mr. Loris, in your answer to my question, that the United States Navy has a hybrid electric destroyer, utilizing some of the technology that perhaps you had in mind. I'm going to now turn to my colleague, Mr. Lamborn, for questions, and then we'll go down through the gavel order.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. And I think we have broad agreement. Wherever we can save energy, let's do so. Wherever we can buy a cheaper source of energy that gets the job done and save the taxpayers money, let's do so. If it's a more efficient type of energy that is easier to transport, has a smaller footprint, as you said, Ms. Burke, that's good for the warfighter as well, for getting those energy resources out into the field where they're needed. There was an incident in 2011, I think went in the opposite direction, and it still bothers me. The President directed Departments of Navy, Energy, and Agriculture to really experiment with biofuels, committed $500 million on that. And among other spending, we had the Navy spending $12 million on biofuels at $26 a gallon. And that's when jet fuel was available at about 1/8 of that cost, 3-something a gallon. So out of that $12 million, my rough estimate is that was a $10 million overpayment if you had just stuck to jet fuel. And biofuels are less dense. They're you don't get as many BTU or per as much bang for the buck, you might say. So I view that as going in the wrong direction. Mr. Loris, would you agree that that was an ill-advised use of $10 million?
I would. it's not that I have anything against biofuels. It's that I have something against biofuel mandates and using biofuels when I don't see any national security justification for buying pricier fuel. And again, that's a huge opportunity cost. That's potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars that could have been spent on conventional fuels that cannot otherwise be spent on military resilience and enhancing capabilities.
Yeah, $10 million. And if the day comes when biofuels are less expensive, sure, let's experiment with them then, and see how effective they are, or how cheap they are, and how available they are. I'm a believer in all of the above. And Mr. Titli, Admiral Titli, I'm going to ask you a question about the Arctic. That's a huge interest of mine. I know it is for the chairman also. What are some of the opportunities and challenges that we have in the Arctic these days?
Well, thank you, sir, for the question. And we could have, as the chair co-sponsored when he was a ranking member, a whole hearing on the Arctic, and maybe in a component of a jurisdiction of the Armed Services Committee. That would be a really interesting topic. What I talk about in my written testimony is the Arctic is arguably.
If I might interrupt, we're thinking about a wintertime Codell.
I'm all for it. I could watch out for the polar bears on the runways because you don't see them in the winter. So the Arctic, as I think everybody knows, is changing incredibly quickly, and our great power rivals, as defined in our national defense strategy, both Russia and China, are frankly taking advantage of this. Russia is both monetizing their northern sea route. They have just, I read in the open press this past week, have passed restrictions that are trying to basically, frankly, keep U.S. and NATO ships, make it harder for us to operate in what I think the United States would term international waters, or waters in which we should be able to navigate. China is looking at a polar Silk Road. So how are we going to really look at this? It is very possible that trade routes could be changing significantly in the next, let's say, couple of decades. While that may sound a long ways away, you all on this committee know better than me that by the time you appropriate funds for a ship, build that ship, and that service life of a ship, that's 30 to 50 years. We need to be thinking that far ahead in the Arctic there. There will be ice-free summers. There will be ice-free falls. Shippers will push the limits of the season. People are both going to get in trouble, and there will be opportunity. We need familiarity in working up there. We need presence. Presence can be Coast Guard, can be NOAA, can be Navy. But we need sovereign presence to build on our scientific capabilities. There's a tremendous opportunities for us in the Arctic. We need to pay attention.
Thank you. And I would like to highlight for anyone who hasn't looked at the briefing memo for this hearing, on pages 7 and 8, there are a list of about 25 different measures that in the last two fiscal years, the last two NDAAs, we put in on a bipartisan basis for the saving of energy and the increasing of resilience. So that's something that we'll continue to work on. And once again, thank you for having the hearing. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lambourne. Now we're going to go by the gavel order, and that would bring next Mr. Crow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. We appreciate your time and insights. I'm particularly interested, I guess starting with Ms. Burke, in your former role, and I'd obviously love to hear from the others about the Energy Resilience and Conservation Program and other similar programs and their capacity and impact on cybersecurity. I mean, our installations draw a tremendous amount of their power from the civilian grid, and that's a very vulnerable grid. If we were to come under cyber attack and if our installations lost power, we would immediately lose substantial capacity for our national defense. So in your experience and background, these microgrid projects at Fort Hunter Liggett and at Fort Hood and other places, do they have the capability to make us more secure by removing us from the grid?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I did not actually oversee that program in my time in office, but we were certainly very concerned about electricity as an operational input. And I agree with the content of your question, which is the department has not really grappled with just how much their electricity demand has escalated in the last few years, in the last decade, how much it's mission critical, even here at domestic bases, and the relative vulnerabilities of that supply, because of course we are reliant for almost all of our electricity on the civilian grid, and it gets even more interesting when you go overseas, because we're often reliant on host nation infrastructure, so their vulnerabilities are our vulnerabilities. I think the department needs to do a much better job of understanding what those vulnerabilities are, but also what the risk is. So the vulnerability plus the threat adds up to a level of risk, and you add in the mission criticalities on those bases. So they need to characterize that much better than they do. And I think in a lot of places there is more than one right answer to how you improve resilience, but microgrids have proven to be one very good answer, especially in a tactical environment, as I think you know. But I think they've already proven to be a very useful answer in a number of places where they've been deployed, including the bases that you talked about. And just to add one last thought on that, continuity of operations is everything. Making sure that the critical loads can be served no matter what is essential. But it's also not realistic to isolate completely from the civilian community around you, because bases are part of that community, and it's not just their electricity they get. They also get their water. Sometimes people live off post. So they need to also be able to work with the community around them and not completely isolate from the community.
Okay. Admiral Titli and Mr. Loris, I'd welcome your thoughts.
Okay. Just very briefly, sir, thank you. I would absolutely agree with everything that Ms. Burke said there. I would only add that the CNA Military Advisory Board, of which I'm a member, did quite a comprehensive report about 2 years ago on the vulnerabilities of U.S. Military to our civilian electric and power grid, and I would be happy to provide the committee with that report. And just to emphasize Ms. Burke's comment that bases are part of the community. We see this in flooding, we see this in climate, in extreme weather, and this makes it as hard as it is within the fence line. We have to think beyond the fence line. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just simply echo what Ms. Burke and Rear-Admiral Titli said. This can provide increased resiliency, improved tactical operations, both in the United States and abroad. And I think there's a number of different maturations of what these microgrids can look like, which again can have broader economic benefits. I think one thing that's compelling to me is these investments and research into some of the very small modular reactor technologies that DoD is currently looking at. I don't know if that's ultimately the way DoD will go, and they're the ones who should make those determinations. But again, I think that's something that could provide tremendous value to our operational readiness all around the world.
Thank you. And one last question for Ms. Burke. I would love your thoughts on just the cost savings element, and we've already alluded to that, but very briefly, with some of these energy efficient programs, are we seeing some cost savings already at some of these facilities?
Yes, Congressman. Cost savings, we are seeing cost savings, and also we have financing tools. They have financing tools in the Department of Defense that allow them to take advantage of private sector financing so that there's no upfront cost to taxpayers. And again, the private sector wouldn't come in and do this if there weren't cost savings involved. So those tools, such as I think you mentioned energy savings performance contracts, have proven successful ways to achieve those goals, those cost savings.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. We might call those public-private partnerships. Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Burke, I apologize for stepping out during your testimony. I was listening in there as I talked to a senator literally about disaster relief for the southeastern United States, which apparently is not coming this week or next week, but perhaps the following week. And I appreciate my colleagues in the House for working with us in the Southeast to resolve this issue. I want to talk briefly about the Marine Corps Logistics Base in Albany, Georgia. As I understand it, this is one of the few net zero installations in the country that we have. They use a combination of solar as well as methane gas from the landfill that is adjacent to them in a combination of a public-private partnership to provide energy for the Marine Corps Logistics Base in Albany, Georgia. when I've been on that base the last few times during a couple of storms, the issue is the solar panels are destroyed, and in many cases, I would tell you that I would just tell you it's reiterated the need to me for redundancy of power supply in our military installations, whether that is redundancy with traditional sources of power or redundancy with alternative sources of power. I very much believe that our bases need to be able to function regardless of the environment that the weather environment that we're in. I have questions about how do we take the model that worked, because what worked in Albany is not going to necessarily be the same thing that's going to work in other bases. Other bases aren't going to be in close proximity to a landfill. Where do you see the areas specifically where we have the most opportunity with bases to move the fastest with proven technology to reduce the amount of emissions that we have in the operation of our bases? Admiral Titli, is there a base that you have in mind and a solution?
Yeah, what I would look for, sir, is really match up what are the resources available. So, you know, in places like the Southwest, of course, we have a lot of potential for solar energy. In the Midwest is really our greatest potential, and up to the Front Range is our greatest potential for wind energy. There could be some
If I may,
partnership.
Admiral, would you agree that we need redundancy with the wind and the solar, and that it will
absolutely.
almost
This
always
is-
be traditional sources, what we consider to be?
This is a kill chain. So you have to look at generation, you have to look at transmission, and then you have to look at how it's used. It doesn't do you any good to get electricity to the building if the building's got blown away.
That's right.
But you have to have all parts of that. And just like a kill chain, if not all of it works, nothing works.
That's right.
So you really have to put all of these things together, and it is going to be different in different places.
Ma'am.
I agree with that, Congressman, and I think the Marine Corps has been very forward-leaning on both the resiliency of fixed installations and how some of these technologies can help them build resiliency, but also for operating positions. So it's great to hear that it's been successful in your district. You said to reduce emissions. I would say that the number one driver there is continuity of operations, and particularly of critical missions, and let that be the driver. Emissions reductions would be an outcome, not the reason. So they do what they do so that the mission is protected. But if they're doing it right, that's often going to be an outcome.
But we do pursue alternative sources of energy in an effort to reduce pollution. Correct?
Yeah,
I mean, we're not
for
pursuing it
domestic
for fun.
bases, there's law, there's statute, and there have been executive orders. I think they've been withdrawn though, to that effect. And certainly, U.S. military bases that are in the United States comply with all laws, and they're certainly mindful of their relationships with the communities around them, and they want to do the best for the communities around them. But what I'm saying is the primary driver for them is always going to be the mission, and I think that's a good way of looking at it.
Mr. Loris?
Yeah, agree. I think it needs to be mission and capabilities driven first, and it also needs to be site and situation specific too, because what works in certain regions of the country doesn't work in others. And if you're factoring in lengthy transmission lines to take the power from where it's produced to where it needs to be consumed, you could create a whole new set of vulnerabilities. So I think it's up to the officials within those bases to identify what makes most operational sense for those bases. And again, that could include an abundance of natural gas as well, because we have a lot of that in this country.
Mr. Chairman, my time's expired.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. I'll now turn to Ms. Slotkin so that she can question her former boss.
Yes, it's great to be here. Thank you. And we did work together when I was acting Assistant Secretary of Defense with a few of the folks in the room here when we published the climate change roadmap, and it was clear back in 2014, just as it is now, that climate change is a national security issue and has implications for our military, for our installations, for our ranges, and overall the safety and security of the country. And in our report, we talked about doing prudent planning and risk mitigation to reverse, or reduce, I should say, the adverse impacts of climate change. Even at that time, we saw some of our bases were dealing with flooding. Some of our ranges were unable to be used because it was getting too hot. And our soldiers were having to conduct exercises differently because of the changing climate. In the January 2019 report, the effects of a changing climate to the Department of Defense, which was mandated, I think, by this committee, which DoD submitted to Congress, the department reported that 53 installations are vulnerable to recurrent flooding, 42 installations are vulnerable to drought, 36 installations are vulnerable to wildfire. And then we all know the changing landscape in the Arctic and what it is allowing the Russians and the Chinese to do up there. We all should have like a blinking light in terms of what that's going to do for our future threat perspective. I want to make sure, I feel very confident that the department itself and members, senior ranking officials within the department understand this as an issue, but obviously I'm concerned the administration is not taking it as seriously as we'd like by the appointment of a man to look at climate change who at least is on record at some point saying that he's not convinced climate change is man-made. So can you help me? And I would just say, I think the aspect that we need to keep in mind, I think maybe Mr. Loris, you mentioned it, is that soldiers do die because we transport such a huge amount of fuel. The reports that I've seen is that 3,000 casualties between 2003 and 2007 in Iraq were because of the transport of fuel. So even if we didn't believe it was a national security problem, that climate change wasn't a national security problem, just wanting to reduce the casualties to our force would be a reason to mitigate our dependency on fossil fuels. So can you help me understand, any of you, based on your conversations with the department, what kind of real prudent planning is going on to mitigate the impacts both to our facilities and then separately on our dependence on fossil fuels?
Congresswoman, I'm going to take the liberty of responding first, since you directed it to all of us. Not enough. There's not enough going on, and I think that's a big problem. And in fact, there's never been a ton of institutional capacity to work on these issues. There's maybe one person in the Office of the Secretary of Defense who really works on this issue full time. And the department is rolling back support for a lot of the assistant secretariats and the services that can actually work on these issues, on the full range of issues that we've been talking about, including cyber resilience of the critical infrastructure. So I think that's the first thing, is the institutional capacity to actually plan deliberately in a way, whether it's for bases or for operations or for understanding the future threat, is not good and needs to be better. You do see at a leadership level recognition consistently now, at least since I know, since 2007, that this is a security issue, that climate change is a security issue, that energy operations, that improving our energy operations is a security issue, but the actual follow through on what that looks like and the commitment to it has not been consistent. So I think we need to see better capacity, more institutional capacity, more deliberate effort to understand how these issues are incorporated into strategy, plans, requirements, acquisitions, and bases.
Thank you, ma'am. There are, I think, two things here, and sometimes they get conflated. One is, how do you provide energy especially to forward units? That's not a climate issue. That's a safety issue, that's a readiness issue, that's an operational capability issue. And it's an extremely important one because people die if you don't get it right. There is also an issue of how do you make sure that our installations where we generate readiness are ready for a changing climate. As Ms. Burke said, there is at least some recognition, but there's very little action on this. And what action is taken is usually talked around. As you know better than probably most people, I tell folks the Pentagon is a hierarchical institution. So that means if your boss is interested, you are fascinated. But the reverse is also true. And right now, the boss is not interested, and I would say at the National Security Council, they have given very definite signals, do not bring this issue up. That makes it much, much harder. The Pentagon is between a rock and a hard place. They understand their board of directors is interested. They know they should be. Their boss is not there. And so anything we can do to, by law, by money, by appropriations, by language, to help them basically overcome the institutional opposition to this in the White House will be most useful. Thank you, ma'am.
Could I quickly add one thing? Sorry, I don't have to. I just wanted to add the DoD Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program, I think is a great program that helps identify these risks. It enhances our scientific ability to minimize risks in the future. And as Ms. Burke said, we need more of it because of these installations that are currently under threat and potentially under threat in the future.
This conversation has laid out the task this committee has. We know there's a problem. We know that bases have a problem. And we also know that there's resistance to this issue of climate change. And so we'll have to find a way of maneuvering through that, at least for the near term, and we will do so. Mr. Brooks, it's your turn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a quick overview, I hope that y'all will do your part in making sure that the military understands that over the past century, sea levels have risen approximately 8 to 9 inches, which is 1/3 of the average century rise over the last 20,000 years. Over the last 20,000 years, the average rise per century has been 2 feet versus that 1/3 over the past century, which is about 8 or 9 inches. So hopefully our military facilities will anticipate, based on history, that there will be future sea level rises that they need to anticipate, and we can get into why it's only 1/3 now versus what it was over the entire 20,000-year period. But I think one thing's pretty sure is that sea levels are likely to rise, perhaps for a variety of reasons. Now to my comment and question on a different matter. Over the past decade, many domestic military bases have been ordered to install very costly energy projects on their property, including solar fields, wind farms, and biomass facilities. In theory, the ability to produce energy on military bases should increase their resiliency by insulating them from the adverse impacts of electricity grids going down due to weather-related events, or, in the event of a conflict, insulate them from cyber attacks targeting vulnerable local electricity grids. Ensuring our mission-critical facilities have access to electricity power is a worthy goal. However, merely producing power on a military base does not necessarily achieve this goal. We must also have the physical mechanisms that permit transmission of the energy produced on military bases to the base's own mission-critical facilities. There are many instances where the energy produced on military bases is not well utilized due to energy or fuel storage issues or insufficient control systems. In other words, in the event of an emergency, the military bases are unable to retain the energy produced on their property in a reliable and predictable way. Admiral Titli, with that as a backdrop, in your opinion, is the Department of Defense investing enough in physical mechanisms to direct that energy that is produced on military bases be available for base mission-critical facilities?
Thank you, sir, for the question. The details of energy management is not my area of expertise. I was not the facilities guy. I was the weather guy.
All right, then, Ms. Burke or Mr. Loris, do you have any insight to share on whether the military should have the ability to utilize for its own bases the electrical power that is produced on its own bases?
Well, sir, the department has 28 million acres under management and 500,000 structures. So there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all answer to that question, but if you have a specific place in mind where that's a problem, then yes. I think that there are definitely risks and threats that require that kind of management, but I think it's very site-dependent.
I think they do need that in many installations. Part of the problem is that the national security justifications for some of these projects are very nebulous, and you don't have to really describe in too much detail why you're making these investments. There was a Government Accountability Office report from, I think, 2016 that looked at a number of different installations that made renewable investments. I think it was 17, so kind of a relatively small sample size. 7 of them had said that they could supply power without the commercial grid. That if the grid went offline, that they would have the ability to supply that power. But only 2 of them actually had that abilities. The others needed far more investments. Fort Benning was one where they needed $30 million of investment. Camp Lejeune was another where they needed $48 million in additional investment to actually provide power if the commercial grid went offline. And so I think that speaks to kind of the broader challenge and problem here is, one, you're talking about more costs, and maybe those benefits of national security and having power when the grid's offline justify those costs. But there needs to be, I think, more concrete definitions and justifications as to why these investments are being made for national security purposes.
Yeah, my reservation was the discovery that while the military bases may produce the electricity, it goes to the general power grid in the surrounding areas, and that the military doesn't have the ability in every instance to retain it for military use if an emergency should arise.
Right, and that was the issue with Fort Benning, is that they needed $30 million more to invest in battery storage technology to keep that power on the base. And so even if the commercial grid went out, that power that they're producing at the base is effectively useless without that battery storage or any type of energy storage system, as well as the distribution capabilities to get it to the rest of the base.
Storage is expensive.
And Congressman, now I understand better. Yes, you're absolutely right. There are places like Nellis Air Force Base, which had a large solar field that originally, when it was built, only returned electricity. They just used the land and it returned electricity, although, again, Nellis did not pay for the development of that solar field. Ideally, you would use that kind of financing and return the power to the grid, but then in an outage, the power from the solar would be dedicated to the base. And that just reflects that different priorities at the time that it was built, which were on cost savings and on ways to leverage the private sector for some of those cost savings. Now, I think for some time now, we've been looking more at resilience as the driving concern. So,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
For your question. Mentioned earlier were microgrids, and that should be part of this discussion as we go along. We'll pick up the microgrid issue. Our next questioner is Ms. Horn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here, and glad to have this conversation on such an important topic. We talked about the impact of readiness on our bases based on a number of weather events, but being from Oklahoma, as you might imagine, tornadoes are a pretty serious challenge, and not just for us, as we've seen in the southeast part of our country, and with growing climate change, the severity and the length of tornado season and the lack of predictability is something that I think is something important to address. So, having said that, Oklahoma averages 56 tornadoes per year. Some of the most deadly tornadoes in the nation have hit very close to some of our major bases. And taking this into consideration, I just wanted to ask, and I'll let this be an open question, I think, at first. If you know of any specific studies that are being done, that the military is undertaking to assess the impacts of tornadoes, specifically in respect to the potential impacts on our bases and readiness.
I'll start with that. Thank you for the question. I think, as far as I know, the tornado studies are being rolled into larger resilience and severe weather studies. And as has been mentioned, I think, by all of the witnesses here several times, there are large differences between bases in geographic areas. So Guam is not worried about tornadoes, but Altus, it's a huge issue in the Midwest. As far as how tornadoes are changing, as you probably know, ma'am, this is actually one of the cutting edges of climate. I chaired the National Academy of Science attribution study, and we found very low attribution on specific tornadoes. There has been studies done that shows the region of tornadoes is moving and the time, as you mentioned. Oklahoma may be getting fewer, actually. but not to everybody. So I think it needs to be rolled in. EF3, EF4, EF5 tornadoes are very, very hard to survive unless you have a strong reinforced building, and we saw the tragedy, of course, in the Southeast just a weekend or two ago.
Congresswoman, I've had the great fortune to go to Oklahoma City and to Tulsa to talk about tornado resilience, and including meeting with members of the National Guard there, who of course are heavily called on to respond. And I think one of the interesting questions too is that it's not a surprise that tornadoes are going to happen along the dry line in Oklahoma, and there's a lot of other weather events that happen there too. It's some of the most significant incidents of billion-dollar weather events and of nationally declared disasters are in your state. It would be a really interesting question about whether we couldn't use the Guard more to also look at resilience, so that they don't have to always just respond. And I think we've seen some really interesting investments in Oklahoma in particular, in Joplin as well, as far as how do you rebuild in a way that makes you more resilient to those kinds of disasters, and the Guard may have a role in that.
Yeah, I would just add that, this seems like an ideal opportunity for the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program at DoD to invest in this type of activity. And maybe they already do so, I'm just not familiar with that. But I think better understanding the risks that are involved and trying to predict as accurately as it can, where tornadoes are going to hit, where they may inflict the most damage, again, is just common sense policy that will help reduce casualties from these types of storms.
Thank you. And one additional question, just on the subject, is as we talk about major weather events, whether it's flooding or I know I'm short, so I'll try to look around. Whether it's tornadoes, whether it's flooding, whether it's the impact of hurricanes, is a question of a need for redundancy. Not only we've talked about the grids and the power supply within bases, but of capabilities amongst bases in the event that we completely lose capacity in certain bases. So that's a question I want to ask, is where you see that and the needs on that subject.
Yes, ma'am. I mean, it's kind of a truism in the military. You always have Plan B. And that's not only in the military, it's also in the civilian side. So I ran the Navy's weather prediction, computer weather prediction capability. We had, about 15 years ago, we had the opportunity to back up the National Weather Service. They had a big fire in their computer center, and the Navy backed up the Weather Service. Now, it could have gone the other way. So there has to be backups. When I ran, again, whether we had Norfolk could back up San Diego and vice versa, you always want to make sure you have that. And just on the tornadoes, I did want to mention the National Science Foundation does have a very robust tornado research program, and the military bonuses and can use that information. Thank you.
And just quickly, Congresswoman, I think inherent in your question is a really important point, which that bases play a very important role in defense support to civil authorities during disasters, both in terms of their own operations, but the communities around them. And I think there has to be an effort to deconflict. Where are the critical missions? Where are we supported? Where are the bases expected to support DISCA? And is the military making sure they can do all those things when there's a complex contingency and a complex emergency? I think it's a very important part of their planning effort that could be more robust than it is.
Before I turn to our next questioner, Ms. Escobar, I just want to put something on the table for the committee to consider as we go through these issues, and it's called resiliency. And so we have the job of looking at all of the military construction projects, all MILCON. Some of those will be new, some of those will be retrofits. In every case, we should, in my view, require that that project be resilient to the risks at that particular location. So if it's the depot outside Oklahoma City and it's tornado country, will that building be built to withstand a tornado? Similarly, we're going to spend some $3 billion at Cap Lejeune. Will those buildings be able to withstand the next flood? Similarly, at Tyndall Air Force Base, the next hurricane. So that'll be part of the work that we'll be doing going forward. Ms. Escobar, it's your turn.
Thank you, Chairman. And I want to thank you for having this hearing and for having us focus on what is really just one of the most significant challenges that our generation faces, and that is climate change. And I know for the military, it's viewed through the prism and the perspective of readiness and national security, but for many of us, there's an additional perspective, and that is our moral obligation to preserve the planet. I have 2 grown children. They're 20 and 22 years old, and I think about the planet that they will be inheriting, and my heart breaks. I cannot believe that we are facing this challenge and that we have been essentially sitting on our hands for so long. And even if we take absolute urgent and really kind of significant action today, we are still going to see a very different planet in 2040 than we see today. But our role, obviously the hat that I have on today is as a HASC committee member. This morning, some of my colleagues and I met with the Secretary of the Army, and one of the things that we talked about was the upcoming budget. And what I really appreciated about that meeting was the idea of thinking about the budget today in terms of the impact it will have several years from now. And I think we need to position ourselves in that same way when it comes to climate change and making us ready to deal with that. And I think that while infrastructure is definitely an important component, natural resources are another component that, an area that really frightens me. In El Paso, we have on Fort Bliss, a key asset for our country, an asset that I share with my colleague, Representative Torres Small. We had a partnership between Fort Bliss and our City of El Paso Public Service Board, and 15 years ago, we celebrated the opening of the world's largest inland desalination plant that takes brackish water and through reverse osmosis produces drinking water. Because like many Southwest cities, we were facing, and we are facing, droughts and limited runoff from smaller and smaller snowpacks to our north. And this was sort of our solution. And although we opened it 15 years ago, it took 15 years of design, plan, funding, building. I feel like we are already so far behind on these kind of innovations going forward, especially with natural resources. I really appreciated Mr. Scott's comments about what is happening in Georgia about capturing the methane and using it along with solar as a way of generating energy. Really appreciated Mr. Brooks' conversation about the grid and finding ways to capture and save electricity for the military installation. Do we even have an assessment of best practices? Do we have an inventory of who's doing what? Do we have a list of opportunities for public-private partnerships or for public-public partnerships, like what took place in El Paso between the city and our Public Service Board and Fort Bliss? Are we even that ready in terms of assessing what we've got and where we've done well?
I'll take a very, very quick stab at that. Thank you, ma'am, for the question, and I fully support your feeling that, we're not where we need to be. In naval aviation, they say one of the things that is of no use to you is runway behind you. We've put a lot of runway behind us on this issue. In 2009, I told the Chief of Naval Operations this would be a challenge, not a crisis, but if we waited long enough, it'll be a crisis. In my recommendations, in my written recommendations, I recommend these so-called climate handbooks. But the types of information you mentioned, ma'am, could be in here. I think one of the things the department, frankly, is kind of struggling with is we don't have, as best I can tell from the outside now, an easily accessible sort of database, spreadsheet, whatever you want to call it, of information that you could you could see, the Congress could see. We could see where our resources are. We could then measure the effectiveness and learn from that and improve. And we need to do this and do this in a fast manner. So I think these are the kinds of assistance that this committee can help the department with. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman. And I agree with you. I have an 18-year-old who, most of our projections about when the damage is really going to set in are mid-century, and he'll be my age. So I do think about that all the time, that it's very real for him.
And he may have children.
And I hope so. Not soon.
Right. But the impact on his children.
Absolutely. And we are behind where we need to be. And I would agree with Rear-Admiral Titli that we should have an inventory and best practices. I think it's a great idea. The one cautionary note I would throw is, remember, they don't have a lot of capacity to respond to that kind of request. So you either also need to help them build the capacity or be very specific that inventory needs to be created by somebody outside the department. Because otherwise you'll see what you saw for the last report, which is they'll just put out a memo that says, tell me what you know, and then you'll get what you get.
Gotcha. Thank you.
I spent a lot of time looking at Department of Energy's national laboratories and what type of innovations we could get from our national labs at DOE, and I think there's a lot of carryover as to what research could look like and how we can transition it into the marketplace. And I think there are obstacles and bureaucracies in working with the federal government and our national labs and even DOD research labs, that I think if we had better engagement with the private sector, you would get more of those spin-off technologies. I mean, look at GPS. I mean, we always credit the federal government for coming up with GPS, but it was a research mission that was geared for a national security objective, and an entrepreneur saw a commercial opportunity and spun that to what we have today. There's all sorts of opportunities that happen at the national labs and research facilities that we could have more of those types of innovations. And they occur now and today, and they occur on some incremental levels, and that's all well and good, but we still need to have better communication and better information available so we have the private sector, in my opinion, using private dollars to commercialize those technologies.
Thank you very much, Ms. Escobar, and I'll turn to Ms. Torres Small.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the witnesses, and thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to pick up where my colleague, Representative Escobar, was speaking about water and about the real impact that climate change has on water, especially in the Southwest. I represent southern New Mexico. And Representative Slotkin also mentioned the 42 installations that are vulnerable to drought. So we see it, of course, here. We also see it overseas. In fact, overseas, water ranks at the top list with fuel as the #1 driver of resupply for our troops. So resupply operations are an essential aspect of military operations, as we've already discussed, but they also draw the attention to remote locations that require convoys to resupply. So to all of the witnesses, do you believe the Defense Department has incorporated water resource vulnerability due to the increased impact of climate change into their resiliency plans for military installations?
I'll just start very briefly. I think, ma'am, it is in its infancy, if it's there. It is, as you mentioned, on Fort Bliss. I think it's sort of looked at as a one-of. What we need to do is collectively realize that the future will not be like the past. This is not some natural cycle that magically comes back. And therefore, we need to be planning 10, 20, 30 for installations 40 years into the future, so that whether it's desal or other opportunities, that we do these in a deliberate manner, cost efficiently, effectively. We're not just throwing money and wasting money at this. So I think the glass is maybe 1/10 full if we're generous.
Congresswoman, no. Is the short answer. No, I don't think so. Now, there are bases where they have been taking water into account for a long time, such as Fort Bliss, but also Fort Irwin in California, which is where the area I'm from, out in the Mojave. So they're well aware that they have water constraints, and they have taken them seriously. And bases do tend to have very strong relationships with the communities around them. So if it's a community problem, the base is often going to be engaged. However, it's not as systematic as it could be, and you alluded to or you said directly, the problem with military operations. And I think that's where there's two interesting plays. One is, how does our water constraints going to play into geopolitics? How is that going to shape conflict? How's that going to shape great power relations? China's a water-constrained country. No, I don't think we know that as well as we should. I don't believe it's incorporated into the way we're thinking about the future as a government, and it should be. And then at the operational and tactical level, it was certainly a challenge in Afghanistan. We were largely shipping plastic water bottles and dropping them to bases that were remote. That was not a great way to resupply, and also it left us with a hazardous waste problem that was also became a health issue for a lot of our forces. So I think both at at the tactical, operational, and then the geopolitical level, there's a lot more to be done here.
What she said.
Oh, great. Then I can ask a follow-up question.
So ma'am, I would just submit that just like the CNA Military Advisory Board did a report on electricity, we also did one on water scarcity, potential for water conflict. I would be happy to submit that to the committee.
That would be great.
Thank you, ma'am.
And just a quick follow-up, and Mr. Loris, if you want to take this one, do you, to the extent that we're planning for water scarcity, do you also advise that we include potential impact, environmental impact that we're already seeing? So, for example, with PFAS and other places where our limited supply for water in aquifers is also threatened by other means.
Yeah, and again, I think this gets back to hopefully what we were all saying earlier is that if it's with regard to what the military is doing, it needs to be capabilities and mission driven first. And then if there's other environmental beneficial outcomes, that's certainly a welcome bonus.
Again, I agree with that. Of course, I mean, that's what I did in office, and it was our guiding principle. But at the same time, the Department of Defense doesn't exist in isolation from the rest of the country. So national priorities and national security writ large, what's good for our communities and what's good for our people, does drive the Department of Defense. Moral obligations, the future, that is part of their responsibility as a public good as well. So I just want to throw that in there.
Thank you. I yield the rest of my time.
Thank you, Chairman. And my apologies. I think there's pollen in the air or something like that I'm not used to. In New Mexico, I would be fine, but here it's a different story. So please excuse me. This question is for Rear-Admiral Titli. The DoD provided testimony to the House Armed Services Committee last year that it had a maintenance backlog of over $116 billion. We've heard testimony in both chambers this year regarding the negative impacts that poor military housing conditions have had on the health and safety of our military members and their families, which of course is a readiness issue. Rear Admiral, is it safe to say that older, poorly maintained infrastructure is also less resilient to extreme weather events such as hurricanes?
I think, ma'am, thank you for the question. I think in general we certainly have seen that. Building codes have evolved. Structures have evolved. We see this in earthquakes. We see this in winds. We see this in flooding. In general, older buildings are less resilient.
Thank you for that answer. In President Trump's press conference announcing he would divert funds from DoD programs, including military construction, for his border wall, he said that the originally intended uses of those funds didn't sound too important to me, quote unquote. Given the now well-documented substandard housing conditions existing at many bases, including in my district at Kirtland Air Force Base, and the fact that the damage to both Tyndall Air Force Base from Hurricane Michael and Camp Lejeune from Hurricane Florence appears to exceed $3 billion for each installation, how important do you think it is that we prioritize rebuilding safe, resilient infrastructure at our military installations?
Again, thank you, ma'am. I can tell you last week I was down at Fort Bragg talking to the troops in the 10th Airborne about climate issues. One of the things the troops reinforced to me was the importance of safe family housing and safe bases while they are forward deployed. There is nothing more distracting if you think that your family is not safe for whatever reason, including extreme weather issues, but it can be other things as well. That is a huge distractor. I lived through Hurricane Katrina, and I dealt with a workforce that went through ground zero on Katrina. I can tell you firsthand, it is a massive distraction unless we have adequate funding for adequate housing so that our families are are taken care of, because that is a critical readiness issue.
Thank you so much. I have a little bit of time left. I'm going to move to training impacts. One of the functions of military installations is to train our force. And I think, Rear-Admiral, you can take this first. Can you provide examples of how climate change impacts training?
There are many examples, ma'am. I'll just give you two very quickly here, is with the combination of drought and heat, and it's not just the drought by itself, but drought and heat tend to make ranges, live fire ranges, much more combustible. Turns out the neighbors don't really like it when you set fire to the range, because they think their stuff's going to burn down too. So that restricts your live fire, which we do, as you know, ma'am, very high-end training so that our troops are as ready as they can be. The other part, and this is some research that's just going on, I've been talking to Climate Central on this, is we are looking at how many and how much increase in so-called black flag days, days where personal training is greatly restricted because of a combination of heat, humidity, and sunlight. And we believe we're seeing an increase in that. The research is very preliminary, but those are just two ways of many that training is being materially affected. Wildfire smoke, not just the wildfires, but the smoke can shut down low-level aviation. That's another one.
Yes, thank you. That is important. Ms. Burke, would you care to?
Yes, Congresswoman, I would agree with that, and also point out that I think Fort Carson had a big fire not so long ago. So it definitely can have a direct, and that's pre-deployment training. So you don't want to lose any of time on range. Also, a lot of the Navy bases are littoral, of course, as you'd expect, and flooding and sea level rise can also affect both training and operations. And we certainly see that locally here down at Norfolk. They have a problem with even nuisance flooding, as they call it, meaning that it's not raining and there's no particular storm surge, but they still have water on the base. That's a problem. So it's definitely a problem. Also permafrost in Alaska, which are unique training ranges that we don't want to lose access to. As it melts, it causes all kinds of problems. So I think there's definitely a training impact.
Thank you so much. Chairman, I yield.
And now let me turn to Ms. Lure.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for letting me participate in this hearing, as I'm not normally on the Readiness Committee, but I am on Sea Power, and I do represent the Hampton Roads region. And so I'll just quote from the recent report that was required by the 2018 NDAA and was delivered in January 19. Navy Region Mid-Atlantic and the greater Hampton Roads area is one of the most vulnerable to flooding military operational installations in the United States. Sea level rise, land subsidence, and changing ocean currents have resulted in more frequent nuisance flooding and increased vulnerability to coastal storms. As a result, and to better mitigate these issues, the region has engaged in several initiatives and partnerships to address the associated challenges. So I will state that at our local level, between federal, state, and local government, there is a lot of coordination, there's a lot of communication. We're working to establish a center of excellence for sea level rise and recurrent flooding through our local universities and local state research activities. Yet the main problem that we see is there really are not any resources currently allocated behind fixing these problems. And in the preparatory documents for today's hearing, when speaking of this same study, it says that it did not meet the congressional reporting requirements to describe future focused mitigations that would be required to ensure the resiliency that we're looking for. And reading through your testimony, ahead of time, there were a couple things that were mentioned. So Admiral Titli, you mentioned that simply, quote unquote, walling off or protecting only the physical base will not be effective. I'd like to comment in response to that, throughout the local area and the 3 joint land use studies that are underway within the Hampton Roads area, the Norfolk one having recently been completed, Virginia Beach in progress, but about to be released, and then one on the peninsula for Hampton. What I've found with my coordination with the Army Corps of Engineers is that we're actually doing the opposite of that. We're not walling off the bases and only studying them. The joint land use studies within the community are not including federal property. So it is quite a conundrum when the water doesn't care about city or municipal boundaries, when our process doesn't allow us to take into account the federal property and the impacts on that, and we're only looking at it from the city level. So Admiral Tensley, you mentioned a risk management approach, and I think that a thorough risk management approach and something similar to your climate impacts handbook that would lay out the impacts and the costs to our military readiness and the costs to upgrade these facilities is really a critical thing that we need for decision making in the future. And you also said that each service should determine its top 1 or 2. Well, we have 8 major installations in the area, and in the documents in your testimony here, the bases within our district and our Hampton Roads region are mentioned no less than half a dozen times between Norfolk and Joint Base Langley Fort Eustis. And I, laud your quoting of the part about the sandbags, but just finding a solution to cut sandbags by 70% is really just the tip of the iceberg on what we're going to need to do in our region to combat sea level rise and recurrent flooding. So, Mr. Loris, I'll quote you. You said that DoD should identify current and near-term vulnerabilities and make the necessary and targeted spending to strengthen military installations. So I agree with that completely. But as you know, also, we have to deal with limited resources. And I think, one, we need to identify these issues, we need to study them, and we need to determine our priorities. But I also think that we can address these as well with some other things that don't necessarily immediately cost money. There's quite a bit of land in our region, for example, that doesn't directly benefit the military's mission. And I think that coordination between the localities and the adjacent military bases and installations, that land could be used to facilitate flooding mitigation, essentially at no cost to DoD, but in a sharing partnership where the land could be provided to some degree for use by the municipalities, and then also to mitigate the flooding on DoD installations and the access roads. And I'll finish by going back to the list of things that were authorized in the 2019 NDAA, which is the Defense Access Roads Program. That's an essential program, but we didn't put any money behind it last cycle. So with the local municipalities in our area, have identified numerous access road projects that will benefit the reliability of access to our military bases within the region. And I think that that's very important that we put resources behind that to provide for future resiliency. And lastly, the New START designation by the Army Corps of Engineers, I think that we should look at in that process through the Army Corps of Engineers, flooding and sea level rise and the impact of flooding and sea level rise on military readiness as additional factors in determining how we rank those limited number of New START or even potentially add additional New START designations on a yearly basis to take into account the impacts on DoD readiness, since there's a limited number of those designations offered each year. So thank you. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I know I didn't really ask a question, but because this is such a critical issue to our region and all of our services and Coast Guard located in the area, I just really appreciate the opportunity to speak and provide feedback on the good research that you've done here and how that can help us as armed services make decisions.
The information you provided is very, very, very helpful to us. We know that we have to deal with the ports or the military naval institutions there. And your background will be very useful as we sort out how we're going to do that and allocate money and resources. Mr. Carbajal, you're next, and then we're going to turn to the 2 members of the committee that have joined us. So,
thank you, Mr. Chair, and I too am not part of this committee, so I appreciate the opportunity to participate with this subcommittee. In light of some statements that have been made, I think it is important to recognize that we are not trying to use the military or our national security as a tool to promote or advance a political argument that climate change is real. There's no question that climate factors are impacting military missions globally, whether it's in the Arctic or in Africa, such that the former Secretary of Defense, Mattis, once said that one of the most significant threats facing our national security is climate change. And our jobs, along with the military's, is to ensure that the planning and resources are in place to address factors that may disrupt our missions, and this includes climate factors. Unfortunately, until recently, we have not provided the necessary resources for the Department of Defense to address the impacts of these climate factors, which is why we are here today. I agree with Ms. Burke that the instability effect is the most important climate security concern. Climate change is and will continue to be a factor in a host of human security issues. And oftentimes, these human security issues lead to regional conflict, which may or may not involve the intervention of the American military. Furthermore, unresolved human security issues leave a void that terrorist or extremist groups can take advantage of. When looking at long-term planning for the U.S. military and installations, climate factors must be considered. I represent Vandenberg Air Force Base. Vandenberg suffered from a severe canyon fire in 2016, where several facilities on the base lost complete power, and a scheduled rocket launch was canceled. The facilities that lost power were operating off a generator until the power lines were repaired. If a base as big as Vandenberg lost all its power due to another disaster, I wonder if their generators would be able to provide them power, enough energy to function for 14 days. Ms. Burke, actually, I am very concerned about the risk that wildfires pose to our installations. Ms. Burke and Admiral Titli, can you characterize the way that wildfires threats have changed? And two, what kind of steps can installations take to improve their resilience to this threat?
Okay, I'm told the science goes my way. Okay, we'll try not to make this too much of a science thing, but basically, as you know, sir, certainly in California, but we see this in large parts of the country. The wildfire season is expanding, and when we see fires, they tend to be more intense. There are many reasons for this, but one of the reasons, not the only one, but one of the reasons is certainly the increased heat and what we have seen is drought in many places. So the risk from wildfires, regardless of the cause, is going up. As far as the mitigation, I think places like CAL FIRE and some of the federal agencies have a pretty good understanding of how do you deal with these fires, including setbacks, including the kinds of roofs, including the way you build basically barriers. But I think unless you've been in one of these fires or near them, it's impossible to understand how fast they go, how hot they go, and how far they can throw embers, which then get the fires going. So again, as I've mentioned several times here, the future is not like the past. And we have to, as we build or rebuild places, we have to think about how do we manage, if we're going to be in an urban wildlife or wildfire interface, how do we manage that? And can we manage that, or do we need to move? Sharon?
And as a native Californian, I respond in particular to the fire risk. It's where my family is, so I'm very concerned about it. I think for the military, you made some very cogent points. It is about resilience to the mission, and my former colleague, John Congery, was sitting behind us, did a lot of work on just how much generated capacity bases have on hand. And I don't think anybody has 14 days of backup power, so that's an excellent point, that would be a problem, and they would have to figure out what to do about it. This is one reason why microgrids are a potentially good solution to be looking at, as well as other kinds of resilience investments. I also think it's worth talking about the mission impacts. So if wildfires in a place like California, which I'm pretty sure that the Department of Defense is the single largest employer and landholder in the state, so I don't think a lot of Californians know that, but it is the case. And there's a huge variety of kinds of missions. And then there's also the National Guard, the California National Guard, which is very actively responding to these kinds of incidents. So I think that the Department of Defense needs to do a better look at what's the future trend line for these kinds of disasters. You know, how much more frequently are we going to see disruption, or are we going to see missions? I don't believe they've done that kind of deliberative active planning for these kinds of disaster missions, and I think it's really important that they do.
Thank you, Ms. Burke. And Mr. Chair, if I could just finish with the 20 seconds that I have to conclude here. I just want to reiterate that in my district, I also represent Camp Roberts. And they've expressed to me that they don't believe they could sustain 14 days if they lost power on a generator. This is a readiness issue, and I do hope that we address these important issues in this year's NDAA. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I will not get into the fire issue because that can go on for several hours. However, I would like to call upon Mr. Kim for questions.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and brief us on this and take our questions. This is an issue that I'm trying to wrap my head around more in terms of how DoD presence in my district connects with climate issues across the board. And the way I'm thinking about it is in terms of three angles. One is about response. So I live in New Jersey in the 3rd District. This is where Joint Base McGuire-Dix-Lakehurst is. And that Joint Base served as the focal point for the coordinated response to Superstorm Sandy. So I see that as one angle in which DoD is connected with climate issues in my district, because we know that it's going to be a matter of when, not if, we get hit by another storm. Two, it's about research. And research and assessment. Right now, we have the Army Corps of Engineers in the district doing an assessment on Back Bay flooding and sort of the issues there and what we can do to mitigate the constant threat that we have from rising sea levels and other issues. And the third one is about resources. And I think a lot of what has been talked about here in terms of the footprint of the Joint Base, energy consumption, and different angles on what we can do to try to make the Joint Base to be stronger in terms of drawing upon alternative sources of energy. I just want to start by, is that the right frame? Or is that a helpful way for me to approach it? Are there things that I'm missing, other angles in which I should be thinking about how to draw upon DoD and involve them on these issues of climate in my district? And number two, more specifically, when it comes to energy issues, what are your thoughts, kind of seeing across the board? I kind of focus and zoom in on McGuire-Dix-Lakehurst, but what are the other kind of ways that other bases, especially in the Northeast, are approaching trying to diversify their energy sources? So I'll just open that up to the group.
Thank you, sir. I'll take a shot at a very quick response to there. I think that's a pretty good way. In fact, it's a really good way of thinking through things. I might add a fourth R, and that's resilience. It's hard to be the center of response if your base itself is kind of beaten up there. On research, I'll just plug something that the Congress has supported now since fiscal year 13. There's a program the Navy submitted called Earth System Prediction Capability. And basically, this is a program spearheaded by the Navy, but with NOAA, NASA, and our national labs, and the U.S. Air Force, of course, to work what I call the 0 hour or very near-term weather all the way out to about 3 decades. And they're really working on the seasonal and sub-seasonal part right now. So how do we give planners an idea all the way from 90 days to a year, not only in the United States, but also where potential contingencies may come? The Congress and both Armed Services Committees in Senate and House have been very supportive of this program. The Weather Research Forecasting and Improvement Act directs NOAA to collaborate with the Department of Defense on this important program. So in addition to CERDIP that has already been mentioned today, I just wanted to mention that since you talked about research. I'll defer to the other witnesses on your other parts of the question on the energy, sir.
I think it's a good frame for looking, Congressman, at the issues, and particularly the bases are it's definitely a hierarchical command, as you know, but it's also very decentralized. And the bases have a lot of latitude to engage with the communities around them. And so not just to call on DoD for research and support, but also to work with local universities and municipal authorities to investigate risk in the same way that Congresswoman Luria mentioned. I think also Congresswoman Holland mentioned that as you are looking at spending for bases, these are the kinds of issues you should be considering up front, not as a sort of after the fact, asking them to take it into account. Ask them to take it into account up front as they're getting their money. And there are other research pots of money that can also support this kind of activity, this kind of research.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think the cooperation is key. When you're looking at cooperation with the local community, with local experts who have been in that region and have studied different land use changes over time, pulling in the appropriate scientists and the specialized knowledge and expertise to better help DoD identify what that preparedness for resilience should ultimately look like. I think when I've seen DoD installations make the necessary adjustments to storms and learned lessons from previous storms, engaging those appropriate stakeholders has resulted in productive outcomes to minimize the risks for infrastructure and personnel in the future.
Great, thank you. That shared foundation, shared language of how we approach these problems is something that we're trying to build with the community. As we know, we have different interests and perspectives coming at this from different angles, and hopefully that'll help us in our own district. Thank you for your input. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kim. Ms. Hulan.
Am I last but not least?
Last but not least.
Okay,
No,
thank
actually,
you so
Mr.
much.
Lamborn and I have the last word.
Wonderful, wonderful, and thank you so much for the opportunity to ask questions of you all. I have a similar line of questioning in the sense that I'm using personal experience to try to make sure I can wrap my head around these really important issues. I served in the military, I served in the Air Force. I did my field training at Tyndall Air Force Base, which is no longer really an operational base. And one of the things I read in the preparation materials was about Black Flag Days. And back when I was doing my field training, we had a lot of them, and this was in the late 80s. Those days when we weren't able to exercise, we weren't able to get ready, be ready, because the weather was just too awful. And fast forward another 30 years, and as you know, the climate has gotten increasingly more and more erratic down in that area to the point where, with that latest hurricane, it has obliterated much of Tyndall Air Force Base. So one of my questions has to do with, do we have a way to quantify and measure those Black Flag Days and the consequences to our readiness and to our troop training? That's my first question, and I don't know which one of you all would be best able to answer that question.
I'll start with that. I think as you look at putting together training, now I have not run a training base, but I've been responsible for training in other components. You always build in a little bit for, for weather, for other contingencies. Similar to humanitarian assistance, we can do some of it, and it really doesn't impact things that much. But at some point, you start impacting readiness, right? I mean, it's like a shutdown. You can do a shutdown over a weekend, but you do it for a month, and there's a huge impact. As I mentioned earlier, we are actually looking at trying to quantify the increase in Black Flag Days, and that would be sort of the first step. Do we see how much has changed up until, let's say, 2019, and then using various models, how much is it going to keep changing? And then my recommendation, ma'am, is work with the training commands of the services to say, hey, be it where the different services do their training, tell me the impacts. So I would kind of go to the horse's mouth, if you will, of the people who are responsible and accountable for training, whether it's advanced or basic training or anything in between, and say, if you have these kind of days missing in, let's say, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, what will you do? How will you manage that risk? And that's how I would look at it, to try to really find out from the people accountable, how are they going to do this rather than
Can I ask a more proactive question then, which is, I guess that I would assume that we probably know the answer to that question, and that in the last few decades there has been more and more of these kinds of days. Should we be more proactive in the sense of not maybe placing training bases in the panhandle of Florida and maybe putting them somewhere where the weather may be more temperate and more realistic, a bit more days available for training?
Well, I used to live in Mississippi, and now I live in Pennsylvania. So you can you can take that maybe as an answer. I think we are going to have to look at that. And I know this becomes incredibly contentious, right? Because that sounds, like a four-letter word starting with B. And I'm not going to grab that 440-volt line right now. But we are, one of the things I think the department from a readiness perspective has to look at is where best can we do the missions. Lots of things go into that, but weather is one of those components.
So my last question with my last minute has to do with Tyndall as well, which is one of my colleagues from a former life has recognized that construction and resilience is a big deal, making sure that we are prepared for the climate of tomorrow. And so she's in the process of literally the innovation is longer nails for roofing, and so that wind speeds won't necessarily tear roofs off the way that they have been. Is that something that in rebuilding a base like Tyndall that we are already thinking about as sort of those resilience, and are we learning from the civilian sector in terms of how they're rebuilding things?
In my written statement, ma'am, I recommend we do that. So I'll give you an example. After Andrew went through Homestead, Florida learned a lot of this, and they had pretty good building codes. I then bought a house a decade after Andrew. It was a new house, North Shore of New Orleans, Lake Pontchartrain, no building codes. Oh, hurricanes don't come here. Well, they do, and they have huge impacts. So it's not only learning the lessons, we know a lot of these lessons. They aren't rocket science. They aren't even that hard. We need to execute them. We need to do it on our bases, but also in our communities where our people are living.
Thank you very much for everyone for sitting and waiting for me. I'm sorry, I was at a different hearing. Of course. Of course, sir.
Mr. Lamborn.
I want to thank the witnesses for being here. I appreciate the testimony of each one of you. And I do want to call attention to the fact, I mentioned this earlier, on pages 7 and 8 of our hearing memo, there are scores of provisions that on a bipartisan basis we put into the NDAA over the last 2 years when Republicans were in the majority. And here's the kinds of provisions that we put in there. Section 2831A adds energy resilience as an element of readiness policy for the department, directs the department to ensure readiness of the armed forces through pursuing energy security and energy resilience. Section 2833 requires the Secretary to prioritize energy security and resilience in awarding energy and fuel contracts. Section 314 encourages development of operational energy policies that improve warfighting capabilities through energy resilience and energy security. Section 312 includes energy resilience and energy security measures among the list of uses for energy cost savings resulting from energy savings contracts. And I could go on and on. So this is something Congress has been diligently pursuing. I'm glad that we'll keep giving attention to it. And anytime we can save the taxpayers' money by finding cheaper sources of energy, to me, that's a good in and of itself, because we spend a large amount of money, but we can't afford to have any of them misspent or used inefficiently whenever possible for the sake of the taxpayers. Plus, using less energy also has environmental benefits, and I would absolutely agree with that as well. So let's keep working on these things. I appreciate having the hearing, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Lamborn, thank you very much. Just a couple of comments. First of all, a very big thank you to the witnesses. Your willingness to engage in the discussion with us has been extremely helpful to all of us. I wanted to just briefly address the issue that Ms. Houlihan raised with regard to Tyndall Air Force Base. It is in harm's way now. It has been in the past and it will be in the future. And the question that this committee is asking, and we will expect an answer from the Air Force, does it make any sense to rebuild at that place? There's some very powerful reasons to be at that place, having your own experience with the exercise testing range offshore, all very important. But we're going to ask the very, very hard question about just how much is going to be done at that base. So, and similarly with Camp Lejeune, are there other places that certain parts of the mission or all of the mission should be conducted? And then if it must be at those locations, the requirement will be that it be built to maximum resiliency given the threats that exist there. Similarly, on every other MILCON project, wherever it may be around the world, that the all-new MILCON, all-new reconstruction or improvements be built to maximum resiliency for the threat in that area. That's what what I think this committee intends, listening to the witnesses, listening to the participation here. So we'll be moving in that direction. I will also note that I was really pleased to hear Mr. Scott talk about methane from a landfill. Next to Beale Air Force Base is a very large landfill that has not been utilized for its methane, but will be in the future, and I suspect there'll be some sort of a pipe from that landfill to the microgrid at Beale, and any other place we have a landfill, we'll use it. It's enormous potential here and enormous need. Thank you very much for the witnesses and for the participation of the members. Mr. Lamborn, thank you. Thank you. We're adjourned.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay, Doug.